Every empire falls. That is certain, no matter how long they reigned and how far their rule stretched. From the Romans who ruled for over 1,000 years, to the Ottomans who spanned continents, and the USSR that changed the political landscape of the modern world. So is the empire we're living under today also crumbling?
Yes. The key question is how fast.
We have bounties beyond those known to the people of any other day.
American democracy is obviously limping on both feet.
America is not the greatest country in the world anymore.
The US empire is falling, and there are 3 symptoms of its impending demise that we can see from looking to the past. Let's start with the oldest of the bunch. These videos are made possible by our supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to help us tell more stories like this, you can become a paying member through the link in the description. Now back to the video. The Roman Empire oversaw the lives of millions of people. Remnants of its great reign still stand in cities across the world, a testament to their reach and influence in the lands they conquered.
Never has Rome been greater or stronger than now.
But then, after 1,000 years of domination, it fell. And just like Rome wasn't built in a day, it didn't fall in one either. Instead, the fall of the Roman Empire was death by 1,000 cuts. But there's one factor in particular we're going to look at: internal decay.
At the height of its grandeur and its glory, a civilization so powerful it could never be conquered from without. Yet it found the seeds of its destruction within itself.
There was a huge disparity between the lives of the elite and the commoners. Rome's elites lived in grand estates, hosting lavish, decadent banquets where they'd feast on peacock tongue and wine from naked waiters.
Every one of these senatorial families has holdings all over the Roman Empire. They're the equivalent of small multinational corporations. They are wealthy in a way that is impossible for us to understand.
The poor lived a very different reality. They worked menial jobs and lived mostly on bread and porridge, living in overcrowded, badly built buildings, prone to collapse and spreading disease.
The games are all about the Roman emperors giving the people what they need, and it's always described as bread and circuses. They had to feed the people of Rome, but once they were fed, they had to be entertained.
Let the games begin!
There were famines, peasant uprisings, and slavery, and the Roman tax system disproportionately impacted the lower classes, while the wealthy often avoided taxes through exemption or corruption.
This is now a new era of Roman history. Rome is no longer what it was. Rome is in decline.
The middle class was shrinking, and the economy became increasingly polarized between the very rich and the very poor, all fueling resentment and instability. So what does this tell us about the US?
Home they've always dreamed of, the happiest investment they have ever made.
The middle class was once a symbol of the American dream. It meant owning your own home with a white picket fence, a car, kids going to school, a perceived ease and quality of life that couldn't be found anywhere else in the world, and that anyone could achieve so long as they worked hard enough.
We are a prospering people, wherever we live, or earn our livelihood.
But for the past few decades, that's all become increasingly out of reach for lots of Americans.
Some people skipping meals because they simply can't afford it.
The number of people experiencing homelessness in a single night went up 12%.
Every year, hundreds of thousands of people are literally asking for donations to afford medical treatment.
Our roads and bridges are crumbling, our airports are out of date, and the vast majority of our seaports are in danger of becoming obsolete.
But Americans from the grocery store to the gas station are seeing their budgets tighten every single month.
And the changes suggested would mean higher taxes for the average American family, widening America's already massive income gap.
90% of the wealth is right here in the top. And then the lower middle class, they've got 0.3% of a piece. Yeah, they have some crumbs there. And the poorest, they have no pie. In fact, they have less than no pie. They actually have a bill for pie. They're in pie debt.
They're struggling to meet rent or mortgage payments, repay college loans, to repay loans for a car.
While the wealthy have become steadily wealthier, wages have been stagnant and costs of living have surged. And it's not like these changes are mutually exclusive. It's off the backs of workers, off the exploitation of the American masses, that the wealthy continue to engorge themselves.
Elon Musk has officially become the richest person in the world. His net worth has crossed the $400 billion mark.
companies buying out the housing market, insurance companies making healthcare unaffordable, politicians taking money from lobbies to protect corporate interests and fill their own pockets, and the working class is well aware.
Hoarding wealth is so harmful, so unethical, so rage-inducing.
Billionaires should not exist.
So you talk about teacher's salary, $2,000 in rent, $400 car payment, you got insurance, you got groceries, electricity. Like, I don't understand how people are affording life right now.
For 5 stitches, $3,800.
What?
Like, it's so freaking hard to live here.
North America is one big scam.
And then there's the internal social and political decay. People have become disenchanted with the illusion of American democracy, of its promises of equality, of equal opportunity for all as long as you pick yourself up by your bootstraps.
You can see a sea of people all united under one cause. They are protesting for racial equality.
The murder of a healthcare executive has led to online popularity for the shooter.
Mangione has emerged in some circles as a sympathetic figure fighting the system.
All this leads to political instability, economic trouble, and social unrest, which weakens the empire at its core. But an empire is bigger than its center. It's a network of vassal states serving the core's interests, and keeping all those entities in check is done through both soft power and hard power. That brings us to symptom number 2. To understand soft power and how it plays into imperial decline, let's look at the Ottomans.
It was a huge empire, dominated by a Turkish dynasty that had its origins in Asia Minor.
The Ottoman Empire was one of the most powerful and enduring empires in history, spanning 3 continents at its height. It was a hub of cultural and scientific innovation, producing advancements in medicine, astronomy, architecture, and engineering that changed the world.
They ruled a considerable mix of peoples and faiths.
There was no great history of ethnic tension, even though there was a history of massively complicated ethnic and confessional coexistence.
It lasted almost 600 years, until it didn't. One factor that contributed to its demise was its waning influence over the peoples and territories it had under its control, also known as the loss of soft power. Soft power is about being more persuasive than coercive, about getting people to comply without using force. In the case of the Ottomans, it was a delicate balance of diplomacy and cultural influence. But over time, the empire's ability to foster loyalty among diverse groups was eroding, aided by rising nationalism within these communities.
The Greeks were the first to rebel against the Ottoman shackles.
The minute you start getting a political world, this system is going to break down. And that is what happens in the 19th century, and that is the great conundrum for the empire.
People stopped buying into the vision of the empire and began to break off and pursue their own interests. Now, the US has been really good at soft power. It began after World War II, when the US positioned itself as a global leader promoting democracy, economic growth, and cultural influence.
Joe's the king because he can buy more with his wages than any other worker on the globe.
It is the most important idea that the United States has contributed to the world. Citizens of every rank can expect to have a better, richer, happier life.
It helped rebuild war-torn Europe, set up major global institutions where it continues to hold significant power, and has exported music, television, and pop culture across the world for decades. And the messaging of this soft power has been consistent and clear.
Shining city upon a hill. After 200 years, she's still a beacon, still a magnet for all who must have freedom.
But for soft power to work, for people to buy into the fantasy and want to participate, they need to see credibility and moral consistency. Now, just to be clear, the US has violated the principles it preaches since its founding, not to mention since its emergence as a global hegemon. It seems the majority of people were willing to overlook that and buy into the American dream. But the illusion is falling apart.
The mob tore down scaffolding, battled their way through the last line of police defense, and broke into the Capitol building itself.
At home, the land of democracy, liberty, and human rights hasn't kept up the best image in recent years, and it's not any better abroad. The US has spearheaded and overseen devastating wars, crippling debt, human rights violations, and environmental damage across the world. which has made it hard to take preaching of democracy and freedom seriously.
America no longer charts a course and therefore has lost all rights to set it, and even more so to impose it on others.
Disillusionment with American values is growing, and in its panic, the empire continues to thrash and bully to stay relevant. That's where hard power comes in, and brings us to the third symptom of the fall of an empire. This one is best illustrated by the Soviet Union. Now, the USSR ideologically rejected the idea of imperialism, but the reality is that it looked and acted like an empire.
The Soviet Communist Party has not faced a serious internal threat to its political rule since the 1920s.
There was a centralized authority overseeing expansion and control of a collection of republics and satellite states, where movements for autonomy were suppressed. What tethered these states together was a unified ideology, communism. But it was also hard power, military might. And that costs money.
It is here, in Red Square, that the superpower Soviet Union holds its military parades, displaying its might for all the world to see.
At its strongest, the Soviet Union had 5 million soldiers stationed around the Union, and pursued wars and conquests to maintain and expand its reach. Then there's all the money spent on the arms race during the Cold War. Money spent on propping up parties in proxy wars across the world, and money spent on wars like Afghanistan, a protracted 10-year-long conflict that cost them $50 billion.
The superpower from the north occupies Afghanistan with more than 100,000 troops, a modern mechanized army.
Eventually, the cost of keeping the empire in check became unmanageable, and the economy took a hit. By the late 80s, people within the Union were struggling with soaring poverty and a low quality of life, with no strategic wins to show for all that money spent. Military and ideological overextension drained not only the economy, but public morale as well, until people got fed up.
In Moscow, the hammer and sickle is lowered for the last time.
Sounds familiar.
All estimates agree that the cost will be at least $1 trillion. The Bush administration never expected the war to drag on as long as it has.
The fall of Kabul to the Taliban marked an abrupt end to America's longest war. The war cost American taxpayers about $1 trillion.
The US carried out long, brutal, expensive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, with nothing to show for it except instability and devastation and financial loss. Then there's the constant ideological wars. The war on communism, the war on drugs, the war on terror, the war on China and Russia. There's a constant boogeyman in the ether to justify US military spending. The US maintains the most bases in the world at over 700 and spends hundreds of billions of dollars on the military every year, more than the next 10 countries combined. It's funding Ukraine in its war against Russia. It might support Taiwan in a war against China. Billions of dollars spent, and we can't remember the last war the US has actually won. But last year, an undeniable awakening happened.
This has been a senseless and a deliberate slaughter, a genocide, and it is happening on our dime.
For over a year, Americans and the rest of the world have watched US politicians from both sides of the aisle cheer on and fund the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza to the tune of billions of dollars. It has shattered the idea that the US is a beacon of justice and human rights, and irreversibly cemented the hypocrisy of American moral exceptionalism. The empire has never been so exposed. And it's shown Americans, who back in the imperial core continue to struggle to live decent, dignified lives, where all their tax money is going, and where it's definitely not. The US has been an empire since its very conception. From colonizing Native American land, to conquering territories overseas, to dominating world politics through global institutions, military might, corporate interests, and foreign meddling. Of all the empires that have risen and fallen, none have come close to having the reach and power of the US. So the idea of it losing its hold over the world seems inconceivable. But while all these symptoms are unfolding and the US empire erodes from within and without, it's not doing so in a vacuum. It does so in the middle of a global shift in geopolitics, in a world that's becoming increasingly multipolar, with countries choosing new allies, new frameworks for collaboration, even new currencies.
The aim of the alliance is to challenge the economic and political monopoly of the West.
All of which is not good for the US. See, the way the global system is designed is, in many ways, for the benefit of America. From reliance on the dollar, US aid, and US debt, to fear of US sanctions, vetoes, and foreign intervention, we live in a world full of systems and institutions designed to prop up the US and keep the rest of the world in check. But these systems aren't going to live forever, because they're inherently unsustainable. They rely on the exploitation of peoples across the world and within the imperial core, and bank on them buying into the bit that all this is necessary, is better for them, and protects them. And as life becomes more unaffordable, countries more destabilized, governments more autocratic, and our environment more unlivable, people eventually wake up. And that's usually the beginning of the end.
BRICS continues to grow in influence and is becoming one of the most important organizations on Earth. BRICS is a Global South-led forum that was founded in 2009 by Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and then in 2010, South Africa joined. Since then, BRICS has continued to grow. In 2024, 4 new countries were officially admitted as full members, which include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. And then at a historic summit in the Russian city of Kazan in October 2024, 13 more countries were officially invited to become partner countries of BRICS. In December, Russia confirmed that 9 of those 13 countries have accepted the invitation, and on the 1st of January 2025, the following 9 countries will now become partner countries of BRICS: Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Thailand, Uganda, and Uzbekistan. And then the other 4 countries that were invited but have not yet accepted the invitation include Algeria, Nigeria, Turkey, and Vietnam. And Russia made it clear that those 4 countries could potentially join as well. They did not reject the invitation, but as of the end of 2024, they had not given an official response. So I made a map that shows the composition of BRICS as of the 1st of January 2025. And now there are 9 full members of BRICS. There are 9 partner countries. There are 4 countries that have been invited to be partners but have not yet officially given an answer. There is 1 country that was invited to be a full member that has not given an answer, that's Saudi Arabia. And there was 1 country that was invited to be a full member but rejected the offer, which is Argentina. When it was originally invited to join, Argentina's center-left government of President Alberto Fernandez said that he was going to join. But then before officially Argentina was accepted, the very right-wing pro-US leader Javier Milei came to power, and he rejected the offer before Argentina officially joined in January of 2024. So what's noteworthy, as you can see on the map, is that BRICS is very powerful in Asia, and it's growing as well in Africa. There are 4 countries that are now part of BRICS officially, and there are 2 more that may be part of BRICS in the near future, Algeria and Nigeria. And Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa. Algeria has the largest landmass in Africa. Over in Latin America, there are now 3 countries in BRICS, including the largest and most populous country in the region, Brazil, with the biggest economy, also including Bolivia and Cuba. Of course, Cuba is a country that has been suffocated for over 60 years by an illegal U.S. blockade. The U.S. has tried to destroy the Cuban economy ever since the revolution in 1959. But Cuba has always been very important in global South movements fighting against colonialism and imperialism. Cuba was part of the non-aligned movement during the First Cold War, and today Cuba has still played a very important role in encouraging unity across the global south. This means that BRICS now has 18 members and partners, and together they represent more than 41% of the global economy when GDP is measured at purchasing power parity, and they represent roughly half of the entire world population. As I'll show later in this analysis today, BRICS also represents more than 1/3 of global oil production, and BRICS countries are very important in global commodity markets, making up some of the largest producers of crucial minerals like nickel and copper and iron ore. And BRICS countries produce huge amounts of food, especially cereals and meat, which are needed to feed the world population. So it's not just that they represent more than 2/5 of the global economy and roughly half the world population. They also are commodity powerhouses, agriculture powerhouses, and energy powerhouses. So BRICS cannot be ignored. The global south is coming together, trying to form some kind of organization for economic cooperation as the global south grows in economic influence. So what does BRICS partner status mean? It means that a country is now part of BRICS and is on the path to becoming a full member in the near future. This is similar to the process that is used by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and many members of BRICS are already members of the SCO. The SCO is more of a security-oriented organization, whereas BRICS is more focused on economic cooperation and especially de-dollarization, creating alternatives to the US-dominated global financial system, which is based on the US dollar. At the 2024 summit in Russia, BRICS officially endorsed a comprehensive plan to transform the international monetary and financial system. I published a video and an article summarizing that report, explaining BRICS's proposal. I will link to that in the description below. But the point is that BRICS is creating alternative financial mechanisms to de-dollarize, so countries that are part of BRICS can trade together using their local currency, so they don't need the dollar. And they're also trying to create new platforms for investments in other currencies to create reserve assets, so central banks in BRICS countries can hold other assets, not just US dollars and US Treasury securities. They're also trying to create an alternative to the SWIFT interbank messaging system, which the US has weaponized in order to impose sanctions on countries, cutting out banks in countries like Russia. So BRICS is going to create alternative mechanisms so countries can process payments between banks. And BRICS is also talking about creating platforms to settle trade imbalances in gold and commodities, including wheat and oil, by creating exchanges that are located in BRICS countries, not the West. So if you want to get more information about that, I have it linked to in the description below. But now I want to go through some of the statistics showing how BRICS is becoming more and more influential in the world. So now that BRICS has 9 full members and 9 partner countries, together it represents roughly half of the global population. There are a little over 8 billion people in the world, and BRICS now has 4 billion people among its members and partners. So if you look at a list of the 20 most populous countries on Earth, 9 of those 20 are now part of BRICS. Of course, India and China are founding members of BRICS. India is the most populous. China is the second most populous. Together, they have more than 2.8 billion people. Indonesia, which is now a BRICS partner, is the 4th most populous country after the United States. So when you combine India, China, and Indonesia, they together represent more than 3 billion people. And then add in Brazil, which is the 7th most populous country. Then Russia is the 9th most populous country. And Ethiopia is the 10th most populous country. So 6 of the 10 most populous countries are now part of BRICS. And then you also have other very big countries like Egypt, Iran, and Thailand, which are also in the top 20 and are now part of BRICS. What about the global economy? Well, the original 5 BRICS members together represent more than 30% of world GDP measured at purchasing power parity, which accounts for what you can actually buy with the currency. So not just looking at market exchange rates, which especially at a time right now when the US dollar is very overvalued, it makes the US economy look bigger than it actually is. And it makes other countries where their currencies have fallen against the dollar look smaller than they actually are. So when you measure at purchasing power parity, you can see that the BRICS 5, the original members, now have a larger share of the world economy than the G7, which is the group of 7 colonialist countries that colonized most of the world. That is North America, Europe, and Japan. If you look at the 9 countries that are now full members of BRICS together, their GDP represents more than 36% of the entire world. China is the world's biggest economy at 19% of global GDP. India is 8% of world GDP. And other very big economies in BRICS include Russia at over 3.5%, Brazil at over 2.4%. Then we can add in the new 9 BRICS partner countries. And although their economies are smaller, Indonesia is still a major economy in the world. Indonesia represents roughly 2.4% of global GDP. And when you add together the BRICS 9 members plus the BRICS 9 partner countries, together they represent just over 41% of global GDP. However, with all of that said, I should point out that GDP is not the best measurement. What is GDP? Gross domestic product. It's a measurement of the value of all of the goods and services produced in a country in one year. However, if you look at a country like the United States, its economy looks like it's very strong, very powerful. But when you break down the composition of GDP, you can see that in reality, manufacturing, the actual production of tangible products that people need for our lives, is just over 10% of US GDP. However, 21% of US GDP comes from the FIRE sector, that is finance, insurance, and real estate. So when banks and realtors and brokers charge more fees, GDP goes up. Or 13% of US GDP consists of professional and business services, including things like white-collar workers such as lawyers and managers. So when US attorneys charge more fees, US GDP goes up. Another example is healthcare. Healthcare represents 18% of US GDP. However, the US health system is notoriously bad. It has some of the worst public health results in the industrialized world, and yet the US spends roughly twice as much on healthcare as a percentage of GDP compared to the other advanced economies in the OECD. Moreover, 8% of US GDP consists of something called imputed rents to owner-occupied housing. What does that mean? It means this is how much an owner of a house in the US would hypothetically pay to rent the house that they own and live in. So in other words, 8% of US GDP is imaginary. It doesn't exist. This is an example of how GDP can be sometimes useful, but it can also obscure. And at the end of the day, it doesn't actually show how productive your economy is if it can actually manufacture things that make people's lives better. And when you break down the sectors that make up GDP, you can see that a huge part of US GDP is overhead. It's corporate bureaucracy. It's fees and red tape and insurance, and you cannot eat that part of GDP. So a more useful measurement can be food production. Let's look at the share of BRICS countries in global food production. I'm looking here at data from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, and it shows the main primary crops produced in the world, which together represent over half of all global agricultural production. In order of size, these are sugarcane, maize or corn, rice, wheat, palm oil, and potatoes. So let's look one by one. When it comes to global production of sugar, which is unfortunately the #1 crop produced on Earth, but of course sugar is in almost everything these days, Brazil, India, and China together represent nearly 2/3 of global sugar production. And then look at maize, or corn. Together, China and Brazil represent nearly 1/3 of global corn production. The US is the biggest producer. And then look at rice. China and India together make up more than half of global rice production. Look at wheat. China, India, and Russia make up more than 40% of global wheat production. Look at palm oil. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand together make up more than 80% of global palm oil production, and Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand are now partner countries of BRICS. And then look at potatoes. China and India make up nearly 40% of global potato production. So now let's look at global meat production. Chicken, pork, and beef make up 88% of global meat production. Chicken is 34%, pork is 34%, and beef is 20%. So in terms of chicken production, the USA is the biggest producer, but the second and third biggest producers are China and Brazil. Together, China and Brazil make up roughly 20% of global chicken production. Let's look at pork. China is by far the world's largest producer of pig meat, representing more than 40% of global pork production. Then there is cattle meat, or beef. The US is the world's biggest beef producer, but Brazil and China are the second and third biggest producers of beef, and together they make up around 20% of world beef production. What about eggs, or as the UN Food and Agriculture Organization puts it, hen eggs, from chickens? Well, there's no competition. China is by far the world's biggest producer of hen eggs, representing 34% of the entire world's production. India makes up 8%, the USA is 8%, Indonesia is 6%, Brazil is 4%, and Russia makes up 3%. So BRICS countries make up more than half of the world's production of eggs. What about seafood? Well, when it comes to global fish production, once again, China is off the charts. The UN FAO divides seafood between capture production and aquaculture production. China alone makes up more than half of global aquaculture production, and then India and Indonesia are the second and third largest, so together they represent more than 70% of global aquaculture production. And then China is also the world's single largest source of capture production of seafood, representing roughly 15%, followed by Indonesia in second place. So together, China and Indonesia make up more than 20% of global capture production of seafood. And finally, let's look at global production of vegetable oils. I already talked about palm oil, how Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, which are now all BRICS partner countries, represent nearly 90% of global production of palm oil. There's also soy oil. China and Brazil are the first and third largest producers, respectively, making up around half of global soybean oil production. China is the third largest producer of canola oil, and Russia is the second biggest producer of sunflower oil. So what's the message that I'm really trying to hit home here? That yes, BRICS makes up now more than 41% of world GDP, but when you look at sector by sector, BRICS is even more important because it makes food for the entire world. It is the breadbasket of the world. And then we can also look at energy. And here we can see how BRICS once again punches above its weight as a very important organization in terms of energy production. If you look at a list of the top 10 oil producers on Earth, half of those countries are in BRICS. The third largest producer of oil, Russia. The fourth largest producer of oil is China. The seventh largest producer is Iran. The eighth biggest producer is the UAE. And the ninth biggest is Brazil. Those 5 countries are all full members of BRICS now. Then if you look at global production of natural gas, once again, you can see how powerful BRICS is. The second biggest producer of gas is Russia. The third biggest is Iran. The 8th biggest producer is China. The 10th biggest is the UAE. The 11th biggest is Indonesia. And the 15th biggest is Malaysia, which is now a BRICS partner state. Of course, climate change is a global problem, especially that countries in the global south have been facing. So let's look at green energy. And here there's just no comparison. China is off the charts when it comes to investment in and installation of renewable energy. China has installed more solar and wind power capacity than the rest of the world combined. And China alone represents more than 80% of global investment in clean energy manufacturing. So once again, I mean, there's just no comparison. China is by leaps and bounds the global leader in renewable energy, in green technology. And the US and Europe are putting heavy tariffs on China because their companies cannot compete with Chinese companies. Finally, let's look at BRICS' position when it comes to global production of critical minerals, which are needed for renewable technologies and manufacturing. If you look at the list of the world's top iron ore producers, you can see that most of them are in BRICS. The second biggest producer of iron ore on Earth is Brazil. The third biggest is China. The fourth biggest is India. The fifth biggest is Russia. The eighth biggest is South Africa. The ninth biggest is Kazakhstan, which is now a BRICS partner. And the 10th biggest is Iran, which is now a full member of BRICS. And then if you look at global production of copper, you can see that there are some heavy hitters in BRICS. China is the world's third biggest producer of copper. Russia is the world's seventh biggest. And Indonesia is the ninth biggest. And we can see the same pattern if you look at global production of nickel, which is a very important mineral for the green transition for renewable energy. Indonesia is off the charts. No country comes even close to Indonesia when it comes to global production of nickel. The third biggest producer is Russia. The seventh biggest producer is China. The eighth biggest producer is Brazil. And the ninth biggest producer is Cuba, which is now a BRICS partner country. Those are some of the most important statistics showing how BRICS is very important in the world. The West would like you to believe that this is an unimportant organization, and because there are so many political differences that it won't make a difference in the world. But first and foremost, BRICS is an economic organization, a forum of global South countries, developing economies that are coming together to try to create new alternatives. They are challenging the dominance of Western economies, and especially they are seeking alternatives to the US dollar. They are trying to de-dollarize, to trade with each other in their local currencies, seeking investments in other currencies, seeking assets that they can hold in the reserves of their central bank so they're not entirely dependent on holding US Treasury securities, US government debt, which also helps to fund the US government as it wages wars around the world, as it imposes sanctions on 1/3 of countries on Earth. As I mentioned earlier, in 2024, BRICS held a historic summit in Russia in which they endorsed a blueprint that calls for transforming the international monetary and financial system. I have a separate video and article that I published summarizing BRICS' plan. I have linked to that in the description below. If you like the reporting that we do here at Geopolitical Economy Report, please like and subscribe. Please share this. I am Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. This is one of the key issues that we follow very closely. So be sure to come back soon to learn more about BRICS and the increasingly multipolar world that we live in. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.
Venezuela is bracing for more protests today after Sunday's presidential elections.
Earlier this year, Venezuela had a pretty major election. On July 28th, over 10 million people went to the polls in a contest to decide whether to elect the incumbent, Nicolás Maduro, the challenger, Edmundo González, or one of the 8 other opposition candidates. And then we saw a very familiar scene.
Of course, the accusations of fraud.
We say victory in quotation marks.
Electoral authorities, which are heavily controlled by the government.
Authoritarian President Nicolás Maduro.
Evil criminal dictator that he is.
Clinging on to power.
Undemocratic attempt to repress political participation.
It was clear from the start this would not be a free or fair election.
Western media has a particular way of talking about foreign elections, and let's call them attempted leadership changes in other countries. And in this video, I want to really zoom in on that. I want to dig deep into the story of foreign elections were served here in the US, and how that reporting affects the way we understand the world outside our borders, specifically when it comes to the reporting of our most important outlet, the New York Times.
So the New York Times is an extremely important newspaper, not only because of its huge circulation, but also because of its massive influence on other media. Its tagline is "all the news that's fit to print," and it really serves as a first draft of history for the American establishment.
This is Alan McLeod, senior staff writer at Mint Press News and the author of this great book on how media in the West covers Venezuela.
It's seen as an authoritative source, in fact so authoritative that newsrooms across the country are faxed a front copy of the New York Times every day so that can actually focus and influence its own reporting. We could probably say that it's the most important newspaper still running.
Now, I want to talk about Alan's checklist. See, when covering a coup, or an attempted coup, on a foreign leader that the US has designated an unofficial official enemy, articles in the New York Times and other Western papers tend to follow a pretty consistent checklist. Blame all economic and political problems on the government. Ignore the effect of any US sanctions. Constantly present the targeted leader as a tyrannical autocrat crushing dissent, no matter what the reality is. Refrain from using the word coup. Prefer instead words like uprising, revolt, or transition. Express ridicule at the idea that the US could be involved in the affair. Depict the new US-backed rulers as democratically minded and downplay any violence they commit in establishing their rule. And finally, blame the deposed leaders for their own overthrow. And you can really see this when you look back through the archives. Like back when the New York Times covered the US-supported military coup d'etat against Eduardo Goulart. In Brazil, back in 1964, the center-left president was overthrown and replaced by Ranieri Mazzilli, the first in a 20-year-long series of military dictators. The New York Times presented it like this: "We do not lament the passing of a leader who had proved so incompetent and so irresponsible. Inflation and a gradual deflation. When it came to the test, he had almost no supporters. Another peaceful revolution. Ranieri Mazzilli is just that and nothing more, an able, patriotic citizen holding the helm of the ship until an elected president can take over. Nation appears to have been yearning for a political cleanup of extremists. Widespread feeling of deep relief and optimism. There's a considerable amount of friendship for the United States, based on mutual democratic beliefs, social informality, and unbounding faith in the national future." Or take Chile in 1973. On September 11th, Salvador Allende, a democratically elected socialist, was overthrown in a military coup by the fascist neoliberal military officer Augusto Pinochet with support from the CIA. Allende had been elected on a plan to nationalize Chile's resources, like its copper mines, then owned by American companies, and used that revenue for improved social welfare and the start of a socialist economy. Here's how the New York Times covered his election. Calling Allende a threat to freedom and criticizing in a dramatic tone a tax raid on the newspaper El Mercurio, one of the most highly respected newspapers in South America. In reality, it was a pro-American, right-wing newspaper funded by the CIA and Nixon himself, according to FOIA documents we only saw 45 years later. And when the US-backed coup deposed Allende, the Times ran this article, denying any US involvement, ignoring Nixon's brutal sanctions, his famous attempt to, quote, make the economy scream, and instead, dutifully checking off most of our trusty checklist. And we can go back even further. Take Iran in 1953. 2 years earlier, Mohammad Mossadegh, a democratically chosen member of parliament, was elected prime minister. His first move was nationalizing the Anglo-Persian Oil Company after 50 years of colonial extraction that generated £115 million in earnings for its British owners and £175 million for the British government. The British responded by imposing a global boycott on Iranian oil, a naval blockade, and essentially tanked the country's economy into submitting back into Western colonial subjugation. The US was a British ally, scared of the socialist direction Mossadegh's policies were taking, and very interested in getting Iran's oil. So, in 1953, it financed anti-Mossadegh media in the country, carefully orchestrated a coup, installed the Shah, and in the process, gained ownership of 40% of the APOC for US companies. Meanwhile, the Shah continued to transform the Iranian economy along capitalist lines and became ever more brutal in his use of state violence, creating a secret police force called the Savak and abolishing the multi-party system that had been in place under Mossadegh. Now, here's how all of that was reported on by the Times. Mossadegh was painted as a Hitler-esque dictator responsible for wrecking the economy. The British came out pretty much blameless. Nationalization was framed as just a populist power grab, and the US's intervention is shown as merely an accusation by the Soviet propaganda media. That last story, by the way, quotes a CIA operative, General Schwarzkopf, declining to comment on the coup because, according to him, he had been out of touch with Iranian politics for too long a period. But we have declassified CIA files now, and surprise, he was orchestrating a coup with the Shah just 18 days before the Times ran that article. But I know, these could all technically be cherry-picked examples. Thankfully, we have some good data to back this stuff up. In an analysis of about 300 New York Times articles about Iran published between 1950 and 1960, both op-eds and editorials, these researchers found everything I just mentioned happened hundreds of times. The British blockade is never questioned, unlike Iran's nationalization policy, which is heavily scrutinized and disparaged as a facade for autocratic power. The sanctions are always presented as a scapegoat for the Iranian economy's problems, and the Shah gets consistently glowing reviews even amidst some of the most brutal crackdowns. Actually, glowing reviews doesn't quite cover it. In an insane article from 1956, he's described as a dark, handsome man with searching eyes and a quiet, rhythmical voice. By temperament, he is calm and unruffled. By inclination, he is a philosopher, given to musing over the problems of his ancient land. Mossadegh is, quote, internationally famous for his bizarre habits, receiving diplomatic visitors in bed, weeping profusely and fainting in public, bounding upstairs like a rabbit? And, okay, they don't just do this with Iran, by the way. Back in 1984, deep into the Pinochet dictatorship and its political purges and crushing neoliberal inequality, the Times was still glazing him up as a, quote, lover of liberty, whose 68 years are belied by his boxer's physique, matched by a trim gray mustache. Pinochet was never described as a dictator, always as a Chilean president and Chile's leader. To remind you, Allende was, quote, a threat to freedom, leading, quote, a government dominated by Marxists. Left-of-center politicians are always described like this. Self-interested, power-hungry dictators. They're always exploiting grievances, grabbing power, or taking advantage of turmoil. A leader elected from a platform that hurts American business interest abroad is almost always self-interested somehow, even as they bring in the most pro-social policies their countries have ever seen. Meanwhile, the right-wing stooges that replace them sail in on unacknowledged violence, a promise of a pure commitment to democratic ideals, and a reassurance for Western audiences that they really represent the interests of the people. And then they'll inevitably reproduce the same pattern of brutal crackdowns, impoverishing the working class, and enriching capitalists domestically and abroad. The Times never cares to explain why these left-of-center, power-hungry dictators choose their progressive strategy and why their right-wing opposition doesn't, nor why the economy hurts workers so badly when sanctions are lifted and the capital flight stops. Once the coup succeeds, all of that gets filed under the "we got rid of the dictator" header and promptly ignored. But let's come back to Venezuela. Venezuela in the late 90s was not doing too well. After the global oil bust and the recession of the 80s, Venezuela was one of the many countries in the global south targeted by the IMF and its infamous structural adjustment programs. The country privatized many of its state-run corporations, sold them to international capital, reduced the government's regulatory power, and opened up trade to devastating international competition. It's in part thanks to these measures, imposed on Venezuela by US-led organizations, that the country's GDP fell over 40% between the 80s and 90s. By 1994, the banking sector had collapsed, inflation was high, foreign debt repayments ate up the government budget, and oil prices were falling. The government was useless, to the point that even Foreign Affairs magazine could admit it. And the institutions were so thoroughly rigged against the workers that when oil prices did start to recover, it didn't mean much for Venezuelans. 15% of the country's GDP transferred from the hands of workers to the hands of capitalists, and the real wage of an average Venezuelan was cut in half over 20 years. This is the context in which Venezuelans elected Hugo Chavez, who almost immediately started implementing changes to the Venezuelan economy that drastically improved life for millions. Revenues from the PDVSA, $12 billion from Venezuela's national oil company and the country's main source of income, were steered towards social spending programs in health, education, and food subsidies. The minimum wage was increased, and the percent of the population living on less than $1 per day fell from 14% in 1998 to 3.5% in 2006. Unemployment, which stood at 15% in 1999, fell to 9% in 2007. Petroleum, communications, electricity, cement, and steel were all nationalized. Illiteracy was eradicated. The student population grew to become the fourth largest in the world. Venezuela gave unqualified support for Palestinian liberation and gave its oil away for free to poor countries and communities, including Black and Native American populations in the US who had their homes heated for free or at heavily discounted rates, courtesy of the Venezuelan government. Venezuela stood up to Western countries and their companies and transformed their domestic policy to radically improve the average Venezuelan's life in what was once considered the worst off country in Latin America. But these are not the policies that make Uncle Sam happy. So in 2002, when yet another US-backed coup briefly removed Chavez from power, the pages of the New York Times looked like this. Here we see all the same tropes on display. Chavez's presidency was repeatedly attacked as incompetent, unpopular, and downright dictatorial over the years. To remind you, Chavez won multiple elections under intense scrutiny from international observers that received the EU seal of approval. His party won a 2000 election in the National Assembly. He passed a recall vote in 2004 with over 59% of the vote, and even submitted his ability to run again for a third term to a national referendum. For context, countries like the UK and Canada have no term limits. Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair both served 3 terms without there ever being any accusations of a lack of democracy in the UK. And I think I need to mention something. Venezuelan elections typically take place with an incredibly high standard for legitimacy. One that's not only scrutinized by far more election observers than anywhere else in the world, but is much more advanced and demanding than what we have here in countries like the US. Since 1998, in order to vote in Venezuela, you need your national ID and your fingerprint scanned. If they both match what's in the national database, you then vote on a touchscreen voting machine. That vote is sent to the National Electoral Commission headquarters in Caracas, and a paper ballot gets printed for you to put in a box. Then you need to put your thumb on an ink blot and stamp it next to your name on an electoral roll, and then you physically sign your name beside the fingerprint. Those results get sent to the head office in Caracas and double-checked with the paper ballots. Those paper ballots are counted in front of representatives from the community and the different political parties, and if there is no 100% match between the digital and the paper, that launches an audit. Alright, so that's a lot. Anyway, in 2013, an audit of the votes in the first presidential election that Maduro won did take place, and it found the results to be 99.98% accurate. That 0.02% discrepancy, by the way, only existed because 22 voters hadn't put their paper ballot in the box after the machine recorded their digital vote. Electoral processes like these are unlike anything we have here, and are part of the reason why Venezuelans' confidence in democracy has shot way up between 1997 and 2013.
Venezuela is one of the most heavily monitored elections in the world. There were over 900 foreign observers there, including from the United Nations and other big organizations. The response I got from those officials ranged anything from indifference to acceptance or friendliness. As I said, I visited 5 stations. Everything seemed to be working completely normal. When I spoke to the officials there, the words they mostly used were calm, tranquil, and fluid to describe the process. been dozens of elections in Venezuela over the last 25 years. It's one of the most election-crazy countries in the world. And every single time the opposition loses in Venezuela, which is most of the time, the New York Times cries fraud and says that there has been some sort of great deception and manipulation going on. However, every time they have claimed this and it has been looked into, the evidence simply isn't there.
So, why does the New York Times' reporting so consistently push the same line of a dictatorial regime from 1999 to today?
So there are a number of filters that really influence the reporting of New York Times and other corporate media outlets. To begin with, it is owned by a billionaire family, and that really has a lot of effect on the output. Ultimately, news organizations are reflections of their ownership, and they're also reflections of the advertisers who actually pay to have the newspaper printed or to have the TV run in the first place. And who advertises in the New York Times? It is multi-billion-dollar corporations. And both the ownership and the advertisers are very keen to make sure that their point of view and their interests are promoted and not challenged. A third factor in this is sourcing. The New York Times has this culture of objectivity, which means you have to go to official sources and not question what they say. Ultimately, it is owned by a billionaire family, the Sulzberger clan, who have worked for decades alongside the CIA, as Operation Mockingbird and the Church Committee revealed. We also know that the New York Times continues to this day to send stories to the CIA and the national security community in general to be edited before publication. There's also the case that if you do put your head above the parapet, there are organized groups who will certainly come at you with a lot of flack. Finally, if you are a foreign news reporter, it's very important to understand that these people are parachuted into countries they often don't really understand. Sometimes they don't speak the language. In the case I'm most familiar with, Venezuela, I know that New York Times reporters are flown into Caracas, live in the wealthy eastern parts of the city. Often they live in gated communities surrounded by armed guards. And so ultimately, everybody they interact with are members of the elite. And when you are talking with millionaires constantly, they have a very particular view of socialism and social movements. And that is not going to be positive. And we can see that coming out in their reporting.
And look, the point of this long rant is not to pretend like any of these leaders are unwavering defenders of democracy with an unblemished record. They're politicians. They're gonna suck sometimes. The point is that these left-of-center leaders are paragons of democratic ideals compared to the tall, dark, and handsome right-wing fascist puppets that they replace or are replaced by. But they're presented as anything but in the Western press. All the while, the violence of the US, its greed, its sanctions, its coups, and its hand-picked dictators armed to the teeth with American weapons get swept under the rug only to be magically discovered 20 years later in declassified documents. The alternative to the American empire is constantly presented as a dangerous, immoral threat, slowly justifying in the mind of millions of Americans the idea that something should be done, that if something were to happen, and if the US were maybe involved, that would be okay. It wouldn't. No country deserves to live or die by decree of American corporations. You can now find Second Thought on Means TV, the home for worker-owned entertainment. I've been working with the team to bring on a bunch more creators, so stay tuned for some exciting new additions to the roster. If you're not already familiar with Means, it's a worker-owned cooperative and explicitly anti-capitalist streaming service. You can find everything from my videos, to original series like Means Morning News, to feature-length documentaries like Abby Martin's Gaza Fights for Freedom, with more amazing content being added every day.
Who would have thought that 2024 would give us woke Al-Qaeda? The leader of HTS, Jolani, has had a wonderful makeover by the Western media. He's gone from brutal terrorist to woke ISIS, with newspapers lauding his diversity. It's crazy to think the West went directly from we need to bomb Afghanistan and occupy it for 20 years after 9/11 to yay, Al-Qaeda's now taken over Syria. If you told an American on September 12, 2001, that 23 years later, the Western media would be celebrating Al-Qaeda? They wouldn't believe you. HTS is led by Mohammed Abu al-Jawlani. He was a former member of ISIS, which was then called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. He actually was sent by the leader of ISIS, Baghdadi, to Syria to start the Al-Qaeda affiliate there, which was called Al-Nusra. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was famous for its tactics of sparking sectarian warfare in Iraq by bombing Shia holy sites, by bombing markets, by bombing places where civilians were gathered. It was an atrocious campaign that really sparked the civil war in Iraq, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. How is it that this group, which has launched terrorist attacks in the West, but also caused untold devastation in the Middle East, is now presented as these freedom fighters? They can rebrand Al-Qaeda, who they spent years saying was the biggest enemy of the West during the war on terror. If they can now rebrand them as our friends, then they can do anything. The US empire and its allies run a ruthless and maximalist empire. Often in the Middle East, they use religious extremists to get rid of leaders they don't want. One of the problems with this is what is called blowback, where these extremists who they fund will then take their fight to the United States, which is what happened with Osama bin Laden, who was formerly on the CIA's payroll. There was a whole load of propaganda and PR done on the part of the Mujahideen. Look at what happened in Libya when we funded and armed and trained the rebels. The rebels became the great cause célèbre for the media. David Cameron called them lions. And then a few years later, these rebels are back in Manchester and blowing up an Ariana Grande concert, killing dozens of school kids. You see it again and again and again. Lessons are never learnt, because lessons can't be learnt, because these policies are not being made in the interests of us, the people in the US, the UK and Europe, or the people of the Middle East, who they see as pieces on a chessboard. They're being made in the interests of a small, narrow elite, so they can continue their geopolitical and corporate control of the world. And actually, the national security concerns and our own safety is a lower priority than that goal. In the UK, they're talking about removing HTS from the list of prescribed organisations. How is it that suddenly, when a group takes power and might start working for us, you can say they're not terrorists anymore? What does the term terrorist even mean? There's a great irony in this country where elderly Jewish people are being arrested by police for things they've said about Palestine under terrorism laws, yet the government is talking about removing HTS from the prescribed list because now it's in our interest. That's how terrorism works. It doesn't mean anything in reality. It's a term that is used by powerful forces in the West to demonize violence which is not in our interest, and it's removed instantly when that violence becomes in our interest. It's not just terrorists that get a rebrand if they start doing as they're told, or it's in our interest. It's also dictators. Look at Assad, a brutal dictator who ruled from 2000 when he took over from his dad, who had ruled from 1970. In 2001, Tony Blair became the first UK premier ever to visit Syria. And what that trip was about was to say to Assad, come into the fold, join us, and everything will be all right for you. They didn't care about the human rights atrocities. In fact, there was a report by Amnesty just before Tony Blair went talking about the horrific conditions in Syrian jails. That didn't feature at all in what they talked about. It was about how can we make Syria part of British and American power? How can we add Assad to our long list of Arab dictator clients? And then in 2002, the following year, Assad came to London and met with the Queen and Prince Charles, then lunched with Tony Blair. Tony Blair had thought about requesting the Queen bestow an honorary knighthood on Assad. This was all about bringing him into the fold, making him one of our own, making him our son of a bitch. It just shows these people don't care about brutal dictatorships. They only care about them if they stop doing as they're told. Keir Starmer said he welcomed the end of Assad's brutal regime.
Well, the people of Syria have lived under a brutal regime for far too long, so I welcome the fact that Assad is gone. I think the whole world welcomes that.
But where did he say that? He said that in the UAE, a brutal UK-backed dictatorship. His next stop after he made that speech was Saudi Arabia. It's one of the most brutal dictatorships in the world, which was actually installed by the British. And we have 11 soldiers permanently based in Riyadh working in the White Army, which is the personal protection force of the House of Saud, to make sure that democratic elements cannot overthrow that regime. So you see, it's all just lies, it's all propaganda. We don't care about dictators. In fact, we love dictators if they do what they're told. The point about Assad was he wasn't doing what he was told, and he was part of the axis of resistance. That's why he had to go. Tehran is where they want to go next, and they want to hit it hard, and they will hit it hard, because Trump is coming in, and no country did better from Trump's previous presidency than Israel. And he only has 4 years left. That means Israel's got a window to get everything they want to do over the next 4 years. And that's been Netanyahu's goal since the 1990s. When Netanyahu came into power in 1996, along with the Americans, they devised a plan to break up all state-backed resistance to Israel. There was a document inside Hillary Clinton's emails, which were released by the State Department, which is a briefing about Israel and Syria and how the United States can help Israel's security. The document says, the best way to help Israel deal with Iran's growing nuclear capability is to help the people of Syria overthrow the regime of Bashar al-Assad. It is the strategic relationship between Iran and the regime of Assad in Syria that makes it possible for Iran to undermine Israel's security. Job done. There was a program called Operation Timber Sycamore, which began in 2012 and is actually one of the biggest CIA covert operations ever. It went on for 5 years and was budgeted at over $1 billion a year to arm and train the rebels who they wanted to overthrow Assad. And Israel itself admitted that they were giving aid to the Syrian rebels. They even went as far as to treat their fighters in Israeli hospitals.
The soldiers are bringing 3 wounded Syrian fighters into Israeli territory for urgent medical care. Since the start of Syria's civil war, about 1,300 Syrians have quietly received medical treatment inside Israel.
2 days after October 7th, Netanyahu met with mayors in the south of Israel and he said, remain steadfast, we are going to change the Middle East. What did he mean by this? Hamas destroyed, Hezbollah decapitated, Assad taken out, Yemen bombed, Iran next. Netanyahu's plan for destroying all resistance to the settler colonial project in the Middle East is coming to fruition. Netanyahu is happy, and he's happy for a reason. Netanyahu said what's happened in Syria is a result of our attacks on Hezbollah. He took credit for it. He's celebrating. He moved more troops further into Syria. They took more of Syria in the week following the fall of Assad than they took in the whole of the 1967 war. They're now saying that they're going to increase the number of settlers they're sending to the occupied Golan Heights. It's part of a plan for a greater Israel and a Middle East which has submissive, dismembered states that keep their people in check and they give support to the Tel Aviv regime if they need it. And they can come out publicly and say, oh, it's a genocide, but essentially they're doing nothing to stop Israel. Who is making life difficult for Israel? Who is actually resisting their genocidal project in Palestine? That was Iran and Syria. It's now just Iran. All the Gulf states, which are also dictatorships, except this time US-backed and Israeli-backed, have done nothing to help the Palestinians. And that is the Middle East that Israel wants. They want smashed states with no power to resist what Israel is doing in Palestine and maybe further afield now. Let's look at some historical examples when we celebrated a dictator who wasn't on the West side being taken out. Libya in 2011, when NATO, which we're told is about defending Europe from aggressive Russia, bombed a country in North Africa. 7,700 bombs in 8 months. Over 300 bombs a day. They destroyed Libya. It's now a failed state. Gaddafi was a dictator. It's a wasteland. But the oil went out to the Western companies, which was the goal of the NATO operation. Iraq in 2003, Saddam, another brutal dictator who ruled in part with US backing for the 80s when he was at war with Iran. And even after he bombed the Kurds in 1988 at Halabja, killing 5,000 people. Only in 1990, when the Gulf War started, when he invaded Kuwait, did the West turn on him. That's because the Middle East, like the whole world, is seen as a chessboard by the US empire and its allies. And people are supported when it's in our interest, when they can do things for us. When they stop, then we pull support. He was taken out in an invasion in 2003. And what happened after that? A brutal civil war, a brutal occupation. The country of 30 million people was destroyed. They then had to put up with ISIS, who ransacked large parts of the north of the country. The Kurds are another good example. The Kurds have been abandoned by the United States multiple times throughout the second half of the 20th century. I believe this will happen again with the new Trump administration. In his first presidency, Trump is thought to have said, why do I care about the Kurds? And wanted to pull support for them. When the Trump administration comes in next year and he wants to get close to Erdogan, he'll give him the green light to go into the Kurdish autonomous regions like Erdogan did in 2018 and destroy Afrin, and I think that Rojava will be destroyed completely. Rojava was a progressive, women-led movement that showed that the Middle East could be run in a different way, but it's going to be smashed because the Kurds have stopped being important to Western interests. The US only backed the Kurds, by the way, not because they were fighting ISIS, but because they sit upon the oil deposits we've been stealing for years, and wheat and agricultural resources. I really hope that the Syrian people have a chance for freedom democracy and sovereignty, and who couldn't be touched by seeing the emptying of those hellholes that Assad kept thousands of political prisoners in. It was a beautiful moment. But look at history, look at Libya, look at Iraq. We need to support the Syrian people who want a sovereign country, of course, but we have to understand nothing good comes in the shadow of external empires. There's a new Sykes-Picot. Syria is being carved up. This is not good for anyone, especially the Syrian people. The Syrian people have a right to be happy that they've overthrown a dictator, and they should be allowed to run their country as they want. But because of the imperial powers, they will never be allowed to do that. The country will be directed and the country will be built in the interests of external power. It's a tragedy. Syrians do have a right to enjoy freedom and sovereignty. They've lived under these brutal dictators for 54 years. Everyone has a right to freedom, but the US empire, the Israelis, Turkey, do not want them to be free. When we're on the precipice of global war, independent media has never been as important as it is now. The mainstream media locks out any kind of nuanced, intelligent debate on these topics. We need voices from across the spectrum who are saying uncomfortable truths to power to be heard. So join the future of journalism and join Double Down News on Patreon.
I predicted that Israel was heading towards a strategic defeat, and my thesis was very simple, and I stand by it to this day. Israel's power depends on the power of the United States. There is no way that this little country, which is surrounded by hundreds of millions of people who are seething with anger at what Israel has done to them and what Israel is doing now to the Palestinian people, there's no way it could get away with dominating this entire region and its rich resources without the full-blown backing of an American hegemon. If America ceases to be the hegemon, Israel ceases to be the regional hegemon. That's inevitable because Israel's power is entirely dependent upon that of the US. And that's exactly what's happening in the United States. The United States is a collapsing empire. It will remain, I believe, a superpower. It will always be a very powerful state, but will it have the power indefinitely to impose its brutal will upon the peoples of West Asia, especially when there's a new game in town? China now has by far the biggest economy in the world on a purchasing power parity basis. Russia has massive resources, has entered into a strategic alliance with China. The era of US hegemony is over, and that spells an end to Israel's apartheid regime, in my opinion. So based upon the evidence, I remain as strongly convinced as I was over a year ago that the Palestinian people will realize their dream of self-determination in my lifetime.